If you enjoy compelling narratives like this one, please consider subscribing. Most people watching right now aren't subscribed yet. There exists a figure in 20th century history whose name has become synonymous with unchecked ambition, moral corruption, and the machinery of genocide. This individual wasn't merely a participant in humanity's darkest chapter, he was one of its principal architects. His story is one of meteoric ascension followed by a descent into infamy that would reshape how the world understood accountability and justice. The man we're discussing today occupied a position of extraordinary influence within the Nazi regime. For more than 2 decades, he stood at the epicenter of power, whispering into the ears of dictators, orchestrating military campaigns, and making decisions that would reverberate through generations. Yet his journey to this position of dominance began not in the halls of political power, but in the skies above Europe during the Great War. Hermann Göring was born into a world of privilege and military tradition. His father had served as a colonial administrator, instilling in young Hermann a sense of entitlement and superiority that would define his entire existence. But it was his service as a fighter pilot during World War I that would forge his identity as a warrior and a leader. He became a decorated ace, downing 22 enemy aircraft and earning the respect of his peers. When the war concluded, he inherited command of the legendary squadron once led by the Red Baron himself, a position that cemented his status as a genuine military hero. However, the post-war years brought devastation to Germany. The nation descended into economic chaos and social upheaval. The celebrated war hero found himself reduced to performing aerial stunts in circuses, a humiliating come-down for a man of his stature and ego. This period of humiliation would prove crucial in shaping his future trajectory. When he encountered Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s, Göring recognized in the failed painter and political agitator a vehicle for his own resurrection and redemption. What made Göring different from many other Nazi leaders was his genuine military competence. He wasn't a bureaucrat shuffling papers in an office. He was a man of action, intelligence, and commanding presence. Hitler recognized these qualities immediately and elevated Göring to lead the SA, the party's paramilitary organization of brown-shirted thugs. Under Göring's direction, these street fighters were transformed into something resembling a disciplined military force. He brought order to chaos, structure to violence, and purpose to brutality. The year 1923 marked a turning point in Göring's relationship with Hitler. During the failed beer hall putsch, an attempted coup in Munich, Göring was severely wounded. The injury required treatment with morphine, a medication that would enslave him for the remainder of his life. This addiction, combined with his unwavering loyalty to Hitler, created a bond between the two men that would prove unbreakable. When Hitler was imprisoned following the failed coup, Göring fled Germany, but he never abandoned his leader. Throughout the late 1920s, as the Nazi Party gradually gained political traction, Göring remained at Hitler's side. Together, they constructed a political movement that would eventually sweep away the fragile democracy of the Weimar Republic. Their strategy was methodical and ruthless. They identified enemies, primarily the communists, and mobilized their supporters against them. Street battles erupted across German cities. The brown shirts clashed with communist militias in running confrontations that left bodies in their wake. But here's where the narrative takes a darker turn, and this is where things become truly sinister. When Hitler ascended to the chancellorship in January 1933, Göring was positioned as one of only 2 Nazis in the cabinet. Within months, Hitler had consolidated total power, transforming Germany from a republic into a dictatorship. For Göring, these were golden years. He married Emmy Sonnemann, a former actress, and Hitler himself served as godfather to their daughter. The former circus stunt pilot had achieved respectability and power beyond his wildest imaginings. But the most consequential assignment came in 1936. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed upon Germany after World War I, had severely restricted German military capabilities. The nation was permitted only a tiny standing army and forbidden from developing modern weapons systems. What the world didn't know was that Germany had been secretly rearming for years, and Göring was the mastermind behind this clandestine operation. He orchestrated the transformation of Germany into a military powerhouse. Factories were constructed in hidden locations. Weapons were manufactured in secret. Training programs were established away from prying eyes. Within a remarkably short time frame, Göring had assembled a military force of over 500,000 soldiers equipped with cutting-edge weaponry and revolutionary technology. But his crowning achievement was the creation of the Luftwaffe, a modern air force that would become the terror of Europe. When the Luftwaffe was unveiled to the world in 1936, it shocked the international community. Here was a nation that had been militarily neutered by treaty, now possessing the most formidable air force on the continent. The implications were staggering. Göring had accomplished what many thought impossible. He had rebuilt German military might while the world watched and did nothing to stop him. This success elevated Göring's status even further. He became the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, answerable only to Hitler himself. He accumulated wealth, art, and property at an astonishing rate. His estates grew larger, his art collections more valuable, his influence more pervasive. He was no longer merely a politician or military officer. He had become a symbol of Nazi power and prestige. Yet as Göring's external power grew, something darker was taking root within the Nazi regime. The focus of Nazi hatred had shifted from the communists to another target entirely. The Jewish people of Germany and occupied Europe were being systematically identified, isolated, and persecuted. What began as discrimination evolved into violence. Shops were boycotted, synagogues were ransacked, families were torn apart, and Göring, a rabid anti-Semite, didn't merely tolerate this persecution, he actively encouraged it. By 1938, the violence had escalated dramatically. Organized riots erupted across Germany. Synagogues burned. Jewish businesses were destroyed. People were murdered in the streets. The world watched in horror, but few nations took meaningful action to intervene. Göring stood at the center of this machinery of hatred, pushing for ever more extreme measures against the Jewish population. In September 1939, Hitler made his move. German armies invaded Poland without provocation or declaration of war. This was the opening act of a continental conflict that would consume millions of lives, and Göring's Luftwaffe was at the forefront of this aggression. The Air Force didn't merely support ground operations, it pioneered entirely new methods of warfare. The Germans had developed a revolutionary military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Luftwaffe would strike first, devastating enemy positions from the air. Dive bombers would swoop down on targets, acting as aerial artillery. Medium bombers would obliterate larger installations. Then, with enemy defenses shattered and their forces in disarray, German ground troops would surge forward, moving with unprecedented speed and coordination. It was a devastating combination of air and ground power that overwhelmed every opponent it faced. Poland fell in weeks. The Low Countries followed. France, which had seemed invincible, collapsed in a matter of months. Göring was the hero of these victories. His Luftwaffe had paved the way for Hitler's conquering armies. But what nobody anticipated was what would happen next, and the consequences would be unimaginable. In 1941, Hitler rewarded Göring's loyalty and competence with the ultimate honor. He was officially designated as Hitler's successor, the man who would inherit the Reich if anything happened to the Führer. Göring was now just one heartbeat away from absolute power over the entire German nation. He had achieved the pinnacle of his ambitions. He was the second most powerful man in the world's most militaristic state. But this elevation to supreme status coincided with something far more sinister. As German armies conquered vast territories in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they encountered enormous Jewish populations. The Nazi regime's persecution of Jews, which had been limited to Germany and occupied Western Europe, now expanded exponentially. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were rounded up, stripped of their possessions, and imprisoned in ghettos and camps. Hitler's regime faced what they perceived as a Jewish problem, a phrase that would become one of history's most chilling euphemisms. The solution they devised would become the most systematic industrialized genocide in human history, and Göring played a central role in initiating this horror. In a letter written shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Göring used carefully coded language to propose what he called the final solution to the Jewish question. He wasn't speaking of emigration or forced labor. He was proposing extermination, the complete and total elimination of an entire people. To implement this monstrous plan, a conference was convened in January 1942 at Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin. Nazi officials gathered to discuss the logistics of mass murder. They debated methods, timelines, and resource allocation as if they were planning an industrial project, because in essence, that's exactly what they were doing. They decided that death camps would be constructed. Poison gas would be used as the murder weapon. Entire populations would be transported to these facilities and systematically exterminated. This represented something unprecedented in human history. Never before had any nation attempted to industrialize killing on such a massive scale. The Holocaust wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of violence or the result of wartime chaos. It was a carefully planned, methodically executed program of genocide, and Hermann Göring had set it in motion. From 1941 onwards, the machinery of death operated with horrifying efficiency. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were erased from the earth. Families were torn apart. Children were separated from their parents. The elderly, the infirm, the young, all were fed into the Nazi killing machine. Göring's role in initiating this genocide made him one of history's greatest criminals. He wasn't merely complicit in the Holocaust, he was instrumental in its conception and implementation. He had transformed from a decorated war hero into an architect of industrialized mass murder. The man who had once been celebrated for his military prowess had become responsible for crimes so enormous that they defied comprehension. Yet, even as Göring was orchestrating the destruction of European Jewry, the tide of war was beginning to turn against Nazi Germany. The military situation that had seemed so favorable just months earlier was deteriorating rapidly, and Göring's own fortunes were about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The question that haunted everyone was, how would this man, who had risen so high and committed such terrible crimes, ultimately face justice? Would he escape accountability? Would he face trial? Or would he find some other way to evade the consequences of his actions? The year 1943 marked a crucial turning point in World War II. On the frozen steppes of Russia, near the city of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army found itself surrounded and trapped by Soviet forces. This wasn't merely a military setback. It was a catastrophic defeat that would signal the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Göring had made a fateful promise to Hitler. He had assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe possessed the capability to supply the encircled army by air, keeping them provisioned and fighting until relief forces could arrive. It was a promise he couldn't keep. The Luftwaffe lacked the transport capacity to deliver the necessary supplies. The operation was doomed from the start. The consequences were devastating. 100,000 German soldiers were killed in the cauldron of Stalingrad. Another 91,000 were captured by the Soviets, most of whom would never return home. The flower of the German army, the elite troops who had conquered Europe, were destroyed in the frozen wastes of Russia, and Göring's credibility with Hitler was shattered. As the war progressed, Germany's military situation deteriorated with alarming speed. The Soviets, having survived the initial German onslaught, began pushing westward with relentless determination. German armies were driven from city after city, from territory after territory. The invincible Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was now in full retreat. Meanwhile, the German heartland itself came under assault. Allied bombers operating from bases in Britain and North Africa began a sustained campaign against German cities and industrial targets. Night after night, waves of bombers thundered over the Reich, dropping tons of explosives on factories, ports, and civilian areas. Hamburg was reduced to rubble, with 50,000 people killed in a single firestorm. Berlin was bombed around the clock, its streets filled with rubble and corpses. Dresden, a city of immense cultural significance, was incinerated in a single night, with thousands of civilians perishing in the inferno. Göring's Luftwaffe, which had once dominated European skies, was now desperately attempting to defend German airspace against overwhelming odds. The problem was fundamental. The Luftwaffe had been designed and built for offensive operations. It excelled at supporting blitzkrieg campaigns and striking enemy targets. But defending against sustained aerial bombardment was an entirely different proposition. The German Air Force lacked the numbers, the resources, and the strategic doctrine to effectively counter the Allied bombing campaign. Fighter pilots flew mission after mission, but they couldn't stop the relentless tide of bombers. Fuel became scarce. Aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was being systematically destroyed. And as the military situation deteriorated, Göring's position within the Nazi hierarchy began to crumble. Other Nazi leaders, sensing that the end was approaching, began to distance themselves from him. Behind his back, they mocked him. They questioned his competence. They whispered that his failures had contributed to Germany's military collapse. Worse still, Göring's personal situation was spiraling out of control. His morphine addiction, which had begun with his wound during the beer hall putsch, had grown progressively worse over the decades. By the end of 1944, he was consuming massive quantities of the drug. His judgment was impaired. His energy was depleted. He was becoming increasingly erratic and unreliable. Hitler, who had once trusted Göring implicitly, began to view him with suspicion and contempt. The Führer made cutting remarks about Göring's failures. He questioned the Reichsmarshal's loyalty. The relationship between the two men, which had endured for more than 20 years, was fracturing under the strain of military defeat. By April 1945, the situation had become desperate. Soviet armies were closing in on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. The Third Reich was collapsing. Everyone understood that the war was lost. The only question was how much longer the fighting would continue and how many more people would die before it ended. And it was at this precise moment, when everything was falling apart, that Göring made a decision that would seal his fate. As shells rained down on Berlin and the Soviet army closed in on the Nazi capital, Göring made a calculation. He recognized that the Nazi regime was finished. Germany would be defeated. Hitler would likely not survive the coming Soviet onslaught. And Göring, as the second most powerful man in the Reich, would be a prime target for Allied retribution. So he decided to save himself. On April 23, 1945, Göring left Hitler's underground bunker, citing urgent military business in the south. In reality, he was fleeing. He made his way to his private retreat at Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, a luxurious mountain hideaway where he had spent many peaceful days before the war consumed everything. Once safely ensconced in his mountain fortress, Göring began to formulate a plan. He would reach out to the Allies. He would offer his cooperation in rebuilding Germany after the war. He would position himself as a valuable asset to the post-war regime. Surely, he reasoned, the Allies would recognize his importance and treat him favorably. On April 23rd, he sent a telegram to Hitler. In it, he requested permission to assume leadership of the Reich and to negotiate peace with the Allies. He framed it as a necessary step to preserve what remained of Germany and to prevent further bloodshed. In Berlin, Hitler's response was immediate and explosive. He was incandescent with rage. How dare Göring presume to take power? How dare he attempt to negotiate with the enemy? Göring was immediately stripped of his position as successor. He was formally accused of treason. He was ordered to resign immediately. But Hitler's subordinate, Martin Bormann, went even further. He decided that Göring should be executed for high treason. An elite SS squad was dispatched to Berchtesgaden with orders to capture and kill the Reichsmarschall. On the evening of April 24th, they arrived at Göring's villa. Göring was placed under arrest. However, despite the death warrant, the SS hesitated. Instead of executing him immediately, they kept him under house arrest. Perhaps they were uncertain about their orders. Perhaps they recognized that the situation was too chaotic for summary execution. Whatever the reason, Göring's life was spared, at least temporarily. The next day, Göring heard RAF bombers flying over Berchtesgaden. Their target was Hitler's nearby mountain retreat, the Berghof. The building was reduced to rubble. And then came news that would change everything. Hitler was dead. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The Führer had shot himself rather than face capture by the Soviets. With Hitler's death, the death warrant against Göring became meaningless. The SS guards who had been holding him no longer had clear orders. The Nazi regime was collapsing into chaos. Within days, other prominent Nazis began to commit suicide. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, killed himself and his entire family. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, took cyanide after being captured by the British. One by one, the Nazi elite chose death over capture. But Göring had other plans. He still believed he could negotiate with the Allies. He still thought he could secure a favorable position in the post-war world. His arrogance and delusion remained undiminished even as the Third Reich crumbled around him. In early May 1945, Göring moved closer to the American lines. He made an arduous journey along roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. His entourage included his wife, his daughter, and numerous staff members. He was traveling with 13 vehicles packed with his possessions, his art collections, and his personal effects. His plan was to make contact with General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. He would offer his cooperation. He would provide valuable information about the Nazi regime. He would help with the occupation and reconstruction of Germany. Surely, he thought, the Allies would recognize his value and treat him with the respect due to a man of his stature. What Göring didn't know was that the Allies had made very different plans for him. On May 7th, 1945, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Göring, still believing he could negotiate, sent his aide, Colonel Bernd von Brauchitsch, to make contact with American forces. The colonel carried a letter addressed to General Eisenhower, in which Göring offered his full cooperation in rebuilding Germany. The letter was delivered to the 36th Infantry Division at Kufstein. The division commander recognized the significance of the capture. Göring was one of the most important Nazi leaders still alive. A special mission was organized. Soldiers were equipped and briefed. The hunt was on. When American forces arrived at Göring's location, they found him waiting with his family and entourage. To everyone's surprise, the Reichsmarschall seemed almost happy to see them. He appeared to believe that his plan was working, that he was about to negotiate his way into a favorable position. He was catastrophically wrong. On May 16, 1945, Göring was paraded before the world's press. Instead of being treated as a valuable negotiator, he was presented as a prize captive, the star exhibit in the Allied victory. General Eisenhower immediately put an end to the media spectacle. Göring was stripped of his medals and jewels. He was placed in a cold, damp cell. The penny finally dropped. Göring was not going to negotiate his way out of this situation. He was going to be tried for his crimes. The Allies had decided, even before the war ended, that the Nazi leadership would face justice. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill had discussed what to do with the Nazi elite. Stalin had suggested executing 50,000 top Nazis. Roosevelt had sarcastically countered with 49,000. Churchill had walked out in disgust. Eventually, they reached a compromise. The Nazi leaders would be tried in court. An international military tribunal was being prepared in Nuremberg, Germany. It would be the first trial of its kind in history, an international court prosecuting leaders of a defeated nation for crimes against humanity. And Hermann Göring would be the star defendant. In November 1945, the trial began. Göring was led into the courtroom on November 21st. Prison had actually improved his appearance. He had lost weight. He had weaned himself off his morphine addiction. He looked sharper, more alert, more formidable than he had in years. The indictment against him was comprehensive. He was charged with conspiracy to wage war, crimes against the peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented horrific evidence: films from the concentration camps, testimony from survivors, exhibits of Nazi atrocities. The case against the Nazi regime was overwhelming. But when it came time for Göring to testify, something unexpected happened. The lead American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, found himself outmatched. Göring was intelligent, articulate, and composed. He answered questions at length, speaking without notes, demonstrating a detailed command of events. Jackson, for all his legal expertise, lacked experience in cross-examination. Göring began to gain the upper hand. It took the British prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, to turn the tide. Fyfe was a seasoned courtroom lawyer who knew how to conduct a devastating cross-examination. He systematically dismantled Göring's defense, pinning him to specific crimes against the Jews, to war crimes against prisoners of war, and to his central role in Hitler's wars of aggression. By October 1, 1946, the verdicts were announced. Hermann Göring was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Göring reacted calmly to the sentence. He was led away without saying a word, but he had already begun to formulate his final act of defiance. After his conviction, Göring demanded that he be executed by firing squad rather than hanged. He argued that as a soldier, he deserved a soldier's death, not the fate of a common criminal. His request was denied. He would hang like any other condemned criminal. The Allies were taking no chances with their most important prisoner. Anything that could be used for suicide was removed from his cell. He was kept under constant surveillance. Guards never left his side. Contact with the outside world was strictly controlled. The Nazis were forbidden from speaking to one another. Hermann Göring was simply too valuable to lose to suicide. On October 7, 1946, Göring received a final visit from his wife, Emmy. They met in the courthouse gymnasium. It was their last time together. Göring spent his remaining days preparing for his execution, which was scheduled for 2 a.m. on October 16, 1946. The execution was supposed to be kept secret, but Göring found out about it the day before. That evening, the prison chaplain visited him in his cell. Göring dispensed with any notion of religious forgiveness. He declared that he felt at ease with his fate. At 10:44 p.m., Göring's doctor visited him for the last time. Minutes later, Göring's guards saw him convulse and exhale. He was dead. He had committed suicide by cyanide capsule. He had cheated the gallows in a final act of defiance. The question that immediately arose was, how had Göring smuggled the cyanide into his cell? The Allies had been so careful, so vigilant. How had he managed to conceal a poison capsule? Rumors circulated that Göring had received help. Perhaps his wife had slipped him the capsule during their farewell kiss. Perhaps a sympathetic guard had smuggled it in. Perhaps someone in the prison administration had deliberately looked the other way. But Göring himself provided the answer in a letter left in his cell. He boasted that he had possessed 2 cyanide capsules at all times. One of them had been hidden in a pot of cream that he used to treat his eczema. The capsule had remained concealed throughout his imprisonment, undetected by the guards and interrogators. So it was that Nazi Germany's last senior figure escaped the noose. He would never be formally executed. He would never face the ultimate humiliation of hanging. In the end, Hermann Göring had managed to exercise one final act of control over his own fate. To some survivors of the Holocaust, it seemed unjust that the man most responsible for initiating the genocide would escape formal execution. But for others, the trial itself had served its purpose. The Nazi regime had been forced to face what it had done. The crimes had been documented. The evidence had been presented to the world. Justice, in its own way, had been served. Göring may have escaped the rope, but he had not escaped history's judgment. He was the most senior Nazi Party figure to stand trial. He had seen his dreams of a place in post-war Germany shattered He had been stripped of all the trappings of power and prestige. He had been forced to confront his crimes in a public courtroom, exposed as a common criminal rather than the great statesman he imagined himself to be. For a man as vain and narcissistic as Hermann Göring, this process must have been excruciating. And perhaps that fact provides some measure of compensation for those who felt he never truly accepted the magnitude of his crimes or the suffering he had caused. The story of Hermann Göring is ultimately a story about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the seduction of power, and the terrible consequences that follow when individuals abandon their moral compass in pursuit of greatness. It is a cautionary tale that remains relevant today, reminding us of the fragility of civilization and the ease with which ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's most consequential and controversial figures, please consider subscribing. Most people watching right now aren't subscribed yet.